Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval Pisa from the origins to the 1200s. We will make probably soon the video from the 13th to the 15th century. It's probably gonna be more dense even than today's one. So I already made videos about the Italian Maritime Republics, and you know more or less the context of this all. I have a pretty hefty medieval Italy playlist, and we are gradually covering also the city-states in the European historical regions series. So I plan to expand a little bit more that side, especially during this autumn and winter, etc. Because I realize people are interested in this kind of middle ground information that it's not so easy to find, like between the literally the ABC of more or less what conceptually we're talking about and the specialistic info, right? You can find studies, articles, and so on. Sometimes we talked about medieval Tuscany in those terms, right? But generally speaking, we remained still somewhat, in fact, either thematically or kind of generally based. So I think that illustrating the main political, military, and social events of these realities is a way to, as for any other, of course, understanding them better, right? It may not be so self-evident why a city-state was so crucial in European history and beyond, but talking about Pisan history is extremely complex, right? So I don't even know how this will be rendered in the video because it's a deep intertwinement of so many different aspects from a strictly, say, political, naval, juridical, strictly, in fact, military point of view that and much more, just artistically or, economically. There is really a lot going on here, and that's where the Italian Maritime Republics videos can help. In general, I already outlined essentially the main differences between at least the main Italian Maritime Republics, the four ones that are usually remembered, and there is this trick to memorize them. That is to say, the ones that emerged chronologically earlier are the ones that eventually were more powerful at the time but declined also, right? Pisa is the second one after Amalfi fundamentally, but also the one that on the longer run will be in fact defeated by Genoa, that will also be knocked out in part at least by Venice, that was the greatest power, and also arguably, with Genoa, maybe it emerged actually earlier than it. But, we will see today how a certain role in antiquity that was well placed in this case already, but, evolved differently in medieval times, and especially in the lack of centralization in the Italic kingdom, as you know, that brought, in fact, mostly the central northern Italian maritime republics to eventually maintain their power throughout the centuries, differently from centers like Amalfi, for example. That was the first one, but were choked by the Norman feudalism and eventually would lose their place in the competition. But not that, feudal powers didn't need, in fact, maritime power that in that sense was enhanced, especially, if you look at Genoa and Pisa in the case of the Siculo-Normans, to make things work, because otherwise, in fact, feudal culture was rather terrestrial in nature, and these republics were fundamentally the only actual naval power existing in Europe. Like, there was no other country that had de facto permanent fleet, and that fundamentally could do anything at sea without the support of these navies. So this has, as we will see now, quite big implications. I made a video, I think it was about the Italians in the Crusade. This was about essentially the Italian Navy organization for the Crusading Warfare series, and there you realize, right, what to the extent to which this single cities could mobilize a sheer amount of moral material forces. And the fact that fundamentally the Italians were in places like Syria, Palestine, Egypt, North Africa, way before, but also way after the same crusades, right? And we will see this perhaps better also in the second video, when you see that there are not just Genoese, but also Pisan colonies in places like Crimea and the Don Mouth and so on. So that is the extent to which, in fact, this community is reached, given the current situation in Ukraine. You think about Crimea, it was fundamentally a Tartar reality that became partly Russian just because of Stalin's deportations, but in the areas, there were the descendants of the Goths, of the Greeks, of the Genoese that were still there, right, in modern times, and even contemporary ones in some cases. But this is another issue. In any case, I made a video about medieval Genoa last year, which between, in fact, 1000 and 1500 AD, which partly exemplifies the Genoese side of the story. This couple of videos about Pisa are going to be a bit more detailed, and probably will come back on Genoese history as well in detail. Right, so a characteristic of the maritime republics in general, not just the Italian ones, is their geographical location. Right, geopolitics does not exist, but geography does help politics minoritarily. And you realize that Pisa is a bit more terrestrial of the Italian maritime republics, because differently from Venice, that is in a lagoon, Genoa, that basically has only mountains in its rear, and so Amalfi, Pisa had a countryside. It had a terrestrial district that, as we'll see, especially in the next video, but also in today's one we'll touch it, will also be of an important consistency. So it was a bit more of a hybrid between a maritime and a terrestrial power at the same time. And albeit the Pisan surroundings are, normally, they don't have any dramatically, let's say, enclosing characteristic, but still, right, the reliefs and the riverways played an important role to isolate the city strategically, and to make it flourish since antiquity. Pisa was founded near the confluence, in fact, of the mouths of the Arno and the Auser. This is the ancient Latin name. It would be the Cerchio in Italian, rivers. And at the time, it was a lagoon area, right? Most areas of Europe, in many ways, were still not bona fide and reclaimed. The Cerchio today has an independent mouth, while its ancient course is to be recognized more or less in a canal known as the Macinante. It is still there, but the face of the country was quite different at the time. The Pisan territory, located to the right of the Arno River, that instead is a major river in Tuscany, was included, and that basically, from which the same Tuscan civilization, in fact, emanates, was included in the east between the sea and the so-called, in fact, Pisan Mountains that divided it from Lucca. That will be an important rival, in fact, of Pisa in medieval times. So they're all ancient cities. Then between the Avenza in the north, the border with the Lunese territory, and the Fine in the south, the boundary of the Volterran area instead. Various roads led to Pisa, right, thus increasing its importance. So you already have basically a city on the Arno mouth, so controlling most of the traffics that come from the hinterland of an importantly rich area. This was fundamentally ruled by the Etruscans and their urban civilization, as a matter of fact. So you can understand why this location was so important. From the east, the two roads right on the Arno. From the south, the Aurelia Road, which was extended by Aemilius Scaurus, reaching Tortona, taking from there on the name of Aemilia, in fact, from the other side of the Apennine in the Po Valley. And from the north, the one along the Serchio River, and another finally even connected Pisa with her port. Right? Very often it's said that Pisa was on the sea in ancient times because the Arno River mouth kind of sedimented all the debris and so on. But telling the truth, this is not correct, because already at the time Pisa was 4 kilometers from the sea, and it did need, however, this port, right, to be connected, to be garrisoned, and to connect, in fact, the market, the city market, to the sea. Now, the origins of Pisa have been over time attributed to the Pelasgians, the Hellenes, the Teutos, or the Phocians, the Etruscans, and the Ligurians, and they remained uncertain until the 80s and the 90s of the 20th century, when at least an impressive series of archaeological finds, including in 1994 the discovery of an Etruscan necropolis datable to the 7th to 6th century BC, has allowed us to affirm that Pisa was, if not just in origin born, but surely built and it lived as an Etruscan city. Right, it was a Villanovian center, which also have been confirmed by an excavation carried out since 2005 in the district of the Lucca Gate. According to the myth, the legend, it was Pelops returning from the Trojan War who founded the city. The debate on the origins of Pisa dates back to at least the Roman historian Cato, but based on archaeological findings, the existence of a maritime center dedicated to trafficking with the Hellenes, with the Phoenicians, and the Gauls, at least from the mid-6th century BC, can be argued with certainty, right? So you don't have to find necessarily like a foundational moment, because naturally also colonization in the Mediterranean occurred, or some kind of pre-existing base, especially in this kind of areas, and the other Latin authors also attribute a not young age to the city. Among these, in particular, there are Virgil, Pliny, Strabo, and Servius. Servius especially claims that the founders of the city were the Teutos, while according to Pliny, the city would have been founded by either them or by Pelops, king of the Pisans in the Peloponnesus, 13th century before Christ. So again, there is a bit this obsession in the Roman sources for connecting the foundation to some ancient hero. Just think about the Trojans with Rome, and there may be some say a glimpse of truth in that. It's just that what really these legends mean is that the cities we're discussing were really prestigious, and so they needed that kind of past, even though made up, or even if those contacts had actually existed, because again, these were trade centers. We don't know basically what happened so early in time with any degree of certainty. But if you look at the Aeneid, for example, in the Virgilian version, Pisa already appears a large and powerful city, and so the Romans in Augustan times attributed to the center a great importance. The thesis that Pisa was Etruscan from the very beginning is still disputed, but somewhat, by approximation, the most accredited. As such, it was therefore placed let's say that the city was placed in a position of bulwark against the area influenced by the Ligurians in the north, west, and in a favorable position for the development of trade with important centers such as the Etruscan Populonia, Velatrium, Felsna, and also with Sardinia already, because of the extraordinary Tyrrhenian position, de facto the best one in the northern sector. And the maritime role of Pisa was already strong, in fact, at the time. The ancient authors attribute even the invention of the famed rostrum to a Pisan. As we were saying before, Pisa was not literally on the sea, but some miles from the coast. And recent studies argued that the expansion of Pisa led to use, in addition to the river port that naturally was already well developed within the center, new sea ones, including one in St. Peter in Grado, one in the San Rossore area, and one near the current Livorno, Leghorn, that was founded instead as a city, just later, right, by the Florentines in the late Middle Ages, but it already hosted the so-called Pisan port, or Triturrita, right? That was properly a fortified stronghold, with with chains for hosting the same fleet and so on. And this was located, by the way, where this on the place where the southern branch of the Arno delta reached, right? And the first two were later abandoned due to the silting up of the lagoon, and the ports of coal were moved along the Arno. Over time, Pisa entered the political orbit of Rome, and it was the base for, in fact, numerous Roman naval operations against the Ligurians, the Gauls, and the Carthaginians. The Romans saw in Pisa, due to her position and the convenience of her port, an excellent stronghold for their war relations with the northern peoples, and they soon got in touch with her, perhaps through a fidus. So it was initially a Roman ally, right? Eventually to become, as we will see now, properly a civitas, and the city benefited, in fact, greatly from the alliance with Rome. Proof of this can be the fidelity of the city in the war against Hannibal, and later in that against the Ligurians, which were infesting the hinterland, and this ended, in fact, notoriously with the final victory of Claudius Marcellus. The Ligurians were basically, fully subjugated, even deported to the Samnium and so on. And from Octavian, it obtained the status of colony, Iulia obsequens, which entailed even a greater autonomy. Her patrons were the same grandsons of Augustus. That relevant the city was for the empire. In 92 AD, the also still visible Caldaccioli aqueduct was built to bring the water from the thermal springs near St. Julian, in fact it's known as St. Julian Therme still today, to the newly built thermal baths. And since the first decades of the 4th century AD, we know that Pisa was governed by a bishop. The cities like these were very deeply integrated in the Mediterranean system, and thus also these are the centers from which to which Christianity spread the quickest, and where was more to organize, and where the local municipal identity was already very more strongly developed. In the course of archaeological excavations led in the garden of the Church of St. Sixtus in the last 3 years, from 2020-2022, other important structures from the Roman era emerged, but they are still under study today. They cannot be visited by the public yet. Now, with the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Pisa did not suffer the decline of other cities, thanks to the aforementioned complexity of her river system, which allowed an easy defense of the same Pisa at the time, a bit like Ravenna. In fact, with the decline of the empire moving its center to Ravenna, Pisa, which was off the road from Rome to Ravenna, to thus the other side of the Apennines in northern Italy, on the major routes for the Transalpine countries. And also, considering the city faced a less safe sea, well, yes, the Pisa does seem to lose some of its importance. There is a general urban contraction in the late antiquity, and the city witnessed the government of Odoacer, the Ostrogoths, and the Byzantine reconquest. But the Pisan seafaring activity during all this time is not extinguished. On the contrary, by the time of the Lombard conquest, the city carries out her naval policy already in an autonomous way with respect to both the Longobards and the Byzantines. This is extraordinary because, considering Pisan nature, we'll see now, this was essentially a deeply Roman city, and also kind of one of those places where, in fact, late antiquity would survive the longest, and by a certain degree never really dying, especially during the early Middle Ages. But already by this time, the Republican, maritime, independent mindset is there. There is a radical continuity with the Roman municipal pride, identity, autonomy that simply lives on in these centers, and not just the maritime ones, by the way. The broader communal civilization fundamentally stems largely from this root. The military importance of Pisa seems to have been relevant, considering that at the beginning of the 7th century her fleet seems to have threatened the same continuation of the peace negotiations between the Byzantines and the Longobards themselves. Gregory the Great recalls in a letter, 603, the presence of some Dromans ready to leave the Pisan port according to the free will of the city, probably to the detriment of the same Byzantines, of which the Pisans are already rivals in trade. Initially, Pisa was the only Byzantine outpost in Tuscia conquered by the Longobards. Thus, Pisa was destined to become part of the Longobard kingdom itself. In fact, also one of its most prestigious cities. You know that Tuscia, Tuscany, was fundamentally annexated by the core Po Valley power of the Longobards, and Tuscany didn't have, aside from these important Roman centers, much of broader kind of regional unity. So basically, like we have seen in other videos, like the Duchy of Friuli, the one of Spoleto or Benevento, etc., were all kind of some provinces on their own. This one instead was directly controlled by the Longobards in that kind of civil and participative administrative career system, in which no broader kind of privatistic feudal detriment was being fueled. And Pisa naturally maintained that dramatic maritime relevance, also considering, as we will see now, that the Longobards expanded from there, or either from Tuscany or Liguria, but the both of them in the same Corsica at the point. And they had probably launched from Pisa, that, as we have seen, had literally a navy there. Those raids that the same Papal and Byzantine sources complained about against Sardinia already at that time. In other words, the Longobards took this Roman sailors the sea to raid, to infest the Tyrrhenian at the detriment of imperial power, and Sardinia would become ever more enclosed within itself, and later even colonized, incidentally, by the same Pisa later on, as we'll see. So this was all kind of positive development for the city. As for most Longobard expansion in Italy, probably wasn't even like a war or siege or anything, right? It would have been, first of all recorded given the size of the city and everything, but it was just a normal passage, right? And from Byzantine to Longobard rule, and as we've seen, that the former was already pretty tenuous, given the city autonomy was maintained also under the latter's domination. We find a Gloriosissimus Dux Gregory mentioned in a Pisan map of 730. This was perhaps a Longobard Duke of Pisa, given that, just like Lucca, for example, these cities would, even not having a major interland from a districtual point of view, counted as duchies on their own. And a bit like Amalfi, for example, just for finding the Italian maritime connection there. So it was really normal. And that, the latter, by the way, was developing in the same way within the Byzantine domination. Even there, technically, those were still part of the Byzantine Empire until the Norman conquest, but practically they were like Naples, Gaeta, Amalfi, etc., de facto independent powers. Now, from this moment on begins a further rise of Pisa on the wake of the broader European economical, demographic revival, and these were the choke points exactly where the continental Mediterranean trades accumulated most of their riches. And in fact, the city becomes the main port of the Tyrrhenian Sea, right, easily. It was a major trade center between Tuscia and Corsica, Sardinia, and also all the southern coasts of France and Spain, with which, as we'll see, it would maintain long relations. Now, with the defeat of the Longobard king Desiderius, to whom Pisa had been faithful in a broader civic institutional fashion, the advent of the Franks and the victory of Charlemagne in Italy, Pisa experienced a crisis from which she, however, recovered quickly again, because the role in the Italic kingdom would have remained identical, and the Carolingians were quite eager to maintain these polities operating within their territories. They didn't pose any, as we've seen, broader territorial threat, right? The interests of the centers were the same ones of the stability of the kingdom. It's a case we were making recently also in that video about, in fact, the Carolingian domination of Italy. And consider that in all this process of the many rulers who entered the city, and given their names that are often Germanic invariably since Longobard Carolingian times and beyond during the various the other imperial dynasty dominations. Well, the Pisan culture remains sincerely Roman, right? And these elements also are absorbed by the primitive citizenry. This is obvious. As we were saying before, there is a strong urban tradition that keeps living on since Roman times. For example, all Roman is the culture of Peter of Pisa, the cantor, the triumphs of Charlemagne, very famous in the in the Carolingian Renaissance landscape, let's say. And of course, this Romanity, and as we have explained thoroughly in the recent months especially, was the sap by which the Renovatio Imperii was fueled. These centers were the most literate in Europe. They were the ones that, given their wealth distribution was more even than basically anywhere else, could provide with these cultural milieu to confront people with a sound education, that were also just closer to the classical past, not just because they were Romance speakers, but because they were in contact with this broader, still kind of Mediterranean cultural, civilizational and also, in a sense, political reality, the proximity with Rome, the access to the most important manuscripts, as we'll see now. We made actually a video about the famous Pisan manuscript, right? Thinking about the circulation of Roman law, of the same manuscripts of the Corpus Juris Civilis. Pisa seemingly had a deep connection with that legacy, because it was also in contact at some point, especially as we will see in the High Middle Ages, with Constantinople. There were many Pisan scholars also in the revival, in fact, of the juridical studies. So there is again a deep civil and administrative culture that also supports, as we'll see now, a very sound military one, especially naval engineering and seafaring, and in fact that would fence off essentially the Saracen invasions, the sweeping the Western Mediterranean off them, together with the other naval power of Genoa. So there is really there a civilizational, a dramatic civilizational development. As we were saying before, territorially, politically, institutionally, administratively, Pisa was part of the Kingdom of Italy and included in the Mark of Tuscany, as it had become. Pisa was more specifically included in the county/duchy, depending from his timeline, of Lucca. That was also a prime center of that kind of romantic we were talking about before. Lucca is the heaven of every early medievalist, given the survival of the early medieval archives, and it's something incredible, especially in such an era where there was such in fact, of written culture and documentary production, and so it provides for studies of Wickham or and the entire early medieval landscape an irreplaceable source of information. In 930, Pisa was transformed into a county center, specifically as a district. The episcopal power in the city being quite relevant, which would be reinforced by the Ottonian policy of the bishops' counts, made videos on. And the advent of Otto I, even more in particular, within the Mark of Tuscia, which still had its capital in Lucca, still demonstrated that Pisa was the most important city of the region, right? In the mid-10th century, the imperial ambassador Liutprand of Cremona called, in fact, Pisa Tusce Province Caput. So literally, Pisa was the head of the Tuscan province. And a century later, the Marquis of Tuscia was commonly called Marquis of Pisa. Quite eloquent. From a naval point of view, the emergence of the Saracens in the 9th century led Pisa to set up autonomous fleets to fight the pirates. And it is exactly these fleets that would guarantee further the expansion of the city. The Saracens were still essentially the frontier manifestation of the broader area of transcontinental trade that Islam controlled, having the upper hand on the trade balance, and thus actually making of these Italian coastal centers competitors, enemies, in some cases also allies, as it's the case, for example, with Gaeta, that at some point sided even with the Saracens. I made videos about these topics specifically, and we have dismantled a bit the idea that during the second invasions, Europe was just some sort of, involved, defensivistic, terrorized reality. On the contrary, the 10th century especially is the one. In the 9th, there is arguably even more activity. In the 10th, there is a contraction indeed, but it's the moment also in which Europe is starting to grow from the within. And when you look at the dramatic naval engineering and military power of the Italian maritime republics that suddenly emerges, turning the tide of the Saracens and taking them over in the process, and effectively inverting the trade balance of Europe, with these cities actually having now the control on precious metals, and in fact financing these massive expeditions and trade connections and conquest basically of the entire Mediterranean coast. You realize that centuries, in fact, like the 9th to 10th, were some of dramatic internal political, military, and social development, and that they're best represented in cases like these. The first phase of the development of Pisan power definitely sees the city engage in the containment of Saracen piracy in the Western Mediterranean. At the beginning, these were definitely stronger because the Carolingian and post-Carolingian institutions were in crisis, so single cities could intervene in this situation, but not quite turning the tide alone. On the longer run, look at the Saracen bases of power also were kind of weaker, right? The southern shores of the Mediterranean have never been enough rich or populated as opposed to the northern ones to have any kind of longer lasting kind of colonization or even demographic impact. In fact, it's the Europeans that influenced radically North Africa, rather the other way around. And the naval enterprises of the Pisans began in 828 with an expedition, in fact, against the African coast. Other Carolingian centers had done the same, right? There was, we've seen it incidentally also in that video about Byzantine Sicily in this phase where, in fact, the Ligurian, the Tyrrhenian coastlines, coastal communities had always been involved in this kind of political and military projection on the Western Mediterranean, and during the same time where Saracens do their piracy, there are Carolingian counts of the same northern Italy that do exactly the same against places like Tunisia, etc. In 871, Pisa participates in force in the defense of Salerno in southern Italy from the attack of the Saracens. So there is still, and of course, a very important connection with for example, the southern Longobards, the Byzantines as well. The Italian navies are capable, in fact, of taking on the same imperial ones. For example, in 970, the Pisans made an important contribution to the expedition of Emperor Otto I in southern Italy, defeating a Byzantine fleet in Calabria. In 1005, Pisa also frees Reggio in the south, the Messina Strait, from the Saracens, as Pope John XVIII had been frightened by the presence of the invaders in the city of the Strait, asking the Pisans for help. Consider that even Rome had some naval power at this time. It was already a papal fleet that also carried out this important joint operations together with Amalfi, Pisa, other centers, same Byzantine fleet at some point. And so there is a very important substratum of naval activity that unfortunately we cannot, let's say, document in the details, because we're talking about eras where we just lack most of the political, military, let's say, in fact, administrative side of the story. But we realized that that capacity was there, and that it basically had never stopped, and that was actually mounting at the time. Other anti-Arab expeditions were carried out by the Orlandi family of Pisa, who carried out the conquest and occupation of Bona, today's Annaba, in 1034. There's also the victorious expedition against the Genoese city in Tunisia, in El Mehdia in 1088, which shows how really at this point the Italians had taken over and were just contending power from one another already, and we will have much to tell about the Genoese-Pisan rivalry, of course. But there is also, for example, the Pisan sack of Palermo, of Islamic Palermo in 1063, with whose marbles the construction of the cathedral square of Pisa was started, by the way. During the clash with the Arabs, there were naturally great territorial increases of the same city, which, for example, in 1016 contributed to the expulsion from Sardinia of the Islamic leader Mujahid. In 1052, the Pisans conquered Corsica, and in 1115, the Balearics. Right, the Italians were interested essentially in coastal possessions. They didn't even care about the hinterland that they de facto controlled just by occupying the market areas, and they had their power in the naval force that could simply resupply the besieged coastal markets, and therefore nullifying the military and logistical capacities of the terrestrial opponents. And this was the blackmail, effectively, that the Italians exercised basically against anyone at that point, for which, as you've seen, there were these masses, sometimes entire cities, burnt down by, I don't know, in this case, the Pisans and the Genoese clashing against each other. But the local authorities couldn't really do anything because they needed Italian trade. So at some point, they could confiscate their goods. They could even repress them violently. We have seen this often in Constantinople, but at the end of the day, this thing could not go on, right? And they needed that trade back because it was the only way to be connected with the international one. And so there were literally no other options because nobody else had in Europe a continuous fleet that they were using non-stop for military and economical activities alike. Right, and if you wonder how this happened, it's not because these cities eventually were born immediately as states, right? You can talk about city-states, first of all, only for the Italian cities, literally, in the Middle Ages, because other leagues, like even the Flemish towns, the Hansa, were something very different from that. They were mostly coalitions that acted as a single power. These were entire single cities that carried out a settled policy, but their political, institutional, administrative outlook was not the one of a centralized state yet. As we were saying before, we mentioned the Orlandi family, for example. These were essentially local clans that had, in fact, land in Tuscany in this case, in also in, as we will see, in the various islands and coasts that, in general, that were colonized de facto, especially in Sardinia in the case of the Pisans. But they began with Corsica, but just so eventually that was taken over by the Genoese. But they had their house towers in the city, and they controlled the shipbuilding. They invested in it. They were the same people who put up the mechanism of insurance, of accounting, that put the capitals there, that they also gathered from looting in the hinterland and fighting against, our neighboring cities, cashing the ransoms of the knightly prisoners, and all this wealth was used to upkeep constantly ships, galleys, right, and the trade that could be carried out through them with the Levant, with other centers, all over the Mediterranean and beyond, by the way, from profiting, even considering the maintenance costs of the ships and the crews, and the Marines and so on. It costed a freaking lot, but these cities were that rich, and that's why they were able, effectively, to maintain at all times tens of galleys at a time. And when there was a broader threat posed to the city as a whole, of course, these clans made front together. Naturally, there were internal clashes and so on, but they could put together as we'll see now, the forming commune, an entire fleet from literally, again, ships that were already at sea perennially. And that's how they made the thing. And this, again, were single cities, very often without much of a hinterland, that managed to keep in check, in fact, the major powers of the time, from the Byzantines, from the Siculo-Normans, the Egyptians, the same outre-mer presence of the Crusaders was basically depending on the Italian supplies, right, and shippings, because otherwise no other power had the funds to maintain a permanent fleet of kind, or even sometimes even just a temporary one, just for carrying out that shipping, right? It naturally was continuous most of the time. So this was a tremendous, I can't stress this enough, source of money, right? But an overwhelming one. You can argue that basically Europe woke up through this wealth accumulation and the fact that civilization reactivated exactly from these centers of enormous financial power. The expansion of Pisa naturally was connected with her Tyrrhenian position, and so opening to the Western Mediterranean. We talked, for example, of the Balearics. The Pisans and the Genoese, as we'll see now, participated in the Reconquista on the eastern shores of the Iberian Peninsula, and this was part of it, except the Balearic Islands could not be maintained for long. Sometimes these expeditions were also were carried out for with objectives that were not the ones of permanent maintenance. Of course, they would always try to do it if it was convenient, though. The latter undertaking had taken place following a war begun in 1113, and that had been promoted by Pisa together with the Pope, Pascal II. This is basically all one with the Crusades, by the way, that were already started, in fact, way before the Near Eastern ones, exactly in these contexts, exactly, especially in the Reconquista and also in the freeing of the Tyrrhenian Islands, and in which, in fact, the Pisans had been protagonists of. So the entire concept was already there way before conventionally, we think, the Crusades of 1095-96 started, really. And there was really a cooperation also with Iberian Provençal powers. For example, the Count of Barcelona and contingents of Provençal and Italian allies participated to this coastal Reconquista. The Pisans were also more involved than the Genoese at the time, especially in Sardinia and in Corsica. Genoa would gradually infiltrate later in these islands, managing effectively to retain control of Corsica, stripped from the Pisans, also throughout the late Middle Ages and the early modern age. From the mid-11th century, the increased power earned the city various papal and imperial awards. Pisa starts championing that, in fact, political, maritime, and also crusading capacity that is deeply needed within the Holy Roman Empire, and that, in fact, the major institutions of which will battle over the control of. This will mark the destiny of the city that traditionally, in fact, would be an imperial, a Ghibelline one, right? And we will talk better about this, especially in the other video after 1200. But consider that at the time of the Gregorian reforms, the Saint Gregory VII granted the legacy of Corsica to the Pisan bishop in 1077. This was a deep aggrandizement because you realized that at that point the episcopal power was actually the most important in the city, and virtually was the one from which the same commune would evolve, as we will see. So this equated to give the same city the control of Corsica, which was a big deal. Urban II also raised the rank of the city to archiepiscopal dignity in 1092, so making it acquire properly a metropolitan status, while Emperor Henry IV in 1081, from a civil point of view, granted the city the right to elect her own consuls. Right, I made videos about the consuls in the Italian communes. They were essentially the first communal magistrates, so a collegial office, just like the Roman consuls in antiquity. That in fact stemmed also from the military class, the milites, that were the ones that were gradually stripping the bishop also of the temporal power on the city, and fundamentally leading to the statalization of the commune on the longer run. The emperor's concession of 1081 in particular reflected, in fact, a de facto situation. In the previous years, in fact, a strong institutional crisis in Tuscany had ended with the agreement between the archbishop and the viscount of the city, from which the Marquis of Tuscia was excluded. And as a result, Pisa would begin to govern herself through consuls, assisted by the council of elders. So these were other, consuls that, little senates that the cities always had, and there would be an expansion of that too. But what Henry IV, Henry the Salian, as you know, also in a moment of significant struggle for the investitures and connected with the control on the Italic kingdom, wanted to ensure the fidelity of the city, right? It was a port, right? And Germany, as a continental power, also needing a Mediterranean policy, was craving for that. And what better center than Pisa, given that Venice was technically not even part of the kingdom and was unassailable. Pisa instead had was also well disposed towards the emperor in function exactly of this kind of autonomization from the local kind of feudal institutions that were, by the way, collapsing. So this is what is interesting in passage also from the post-Carolingian to the communal era, that of course the emperors facilitated this further to win over the support of these centers. What in 1081 Henry IV specifically did was confirming the Pisan maritime customs, and he even recalled a colloquium, literally, which sonantibus campanis, so bells ringing in the document, was collected to elect. We don't know well whether with the character of stable or temporary judiciary, 12 citizens, perhaps in fact germs of the future council of the Sapientes that you also find later on in the institutional history of the city. From the same years, between 1080 and 1085, the first memory of the consuls is in a Sardinian map as an evidence. As we said in those videos about the Italian communes, all the cities of the Italic kingdom fundamentally underwent the same political and institutional development in parallel, right? Even though there was factually no central power, these cities were so deeply intertwined that basically they were doing all the same thing at the same time. The consular regime is affirmed all over the Italic kingdom in the same years, the last decades of the 11th century, and it would maintain its control and for a good century, right, up to the rise of the populace and some other interesting development that we discussed here and there. I have an Italian communes playlist where you will find, in fact, references to the same Pisa. Needless to say, this Pisan political development, also the consular regime, was deeply stemming from sort of the needs of the political control of the naval expeditions, right, together with very important practices that actually as we're also remembering before, the birth of accounting, the development of some guilds and some contracts, this broader and massive investments in naval armament and shipping and so on, that all these big powerful clans that were essentially the representatives of the so-called militia, and so the class from which the consuls were drawn, were dramatically tied to. The consuls are remembered after the bishop and after the viscount, who was still judge and steward, that is, head of the royal court and marquis of the city. So, as you understand, that this transition from, say, feudal to feudal hierarchy to kind of autonomous institutions was quite gradual. Nobody at the time was thinking like, now we are something else. There is no empire. There is no. These people thought to be living in the Christian Roman Empire since ever, and that this was just the order of things, and that there was a common law dimension, let's say, that also entailed the recovery of civil law, unironically enough, that was proper of the local communities, and that had the right to organize, to govern themselves autonomously. And the emperor, as king of Italy, was to essentially intervene and to sanction this, to protect the pre-existing rights of the communities, and to resolve the greater problems. But these communities were also acquiring the instruments to do that by themselves, and definitely not in a naive way. And what is interesting in this list is that the spiritual leader, the bishop, the representative of the ancient feudal powers, and the nascent citizen organism, let's say, are almost on the same level, in a sort of consortium. That was, and ironically, also the same term used. The consortia were these guilds were being formed for the shipping, the maritime enterprise, right? So it means literally having the same destiny, the same source in Latin. So the consortes are the ones that share that kind of alliance connection, and this is not different from the feudal bonds fundamentally in other contexts. And they were all united in that sense for the interests of the city, right? So all these representatives now, also the feudal one, looked historically a bit, traditionally a bit more to institutions that were in fact dissolving themselves with the rise of the communes, again, at the city itself. So that municipal spirit and, in fact, single identities in which everyone was investing because the city was becoming ever more powerful. So this is a stupendous manifestation of the ideal unity that was achieved, and the same monuments that still adorn today the so-called Miracles Square with the dome, the famous Leaning Tower and so on, are the best, also from an artistical point of view, manifestation of and the wealth of them, right? The size, the cost, the meaning, the symbol of this de facto universal power reflected in that city as a part of the universal wall. In this first expansioning phase, Pisa found herself often allied also with the rising power of the Normans of the Kingdom of Sicily. As we were saying before, the Normans, as Western Franks, essentially, many of them were, as you know, not just from Normandy, but from places like Brittany, Flanders, but there were many other French, Germans, same Italians, broadly meant. But there were expression mostly of a land culture, right? They were not tremendous seafarers, right? They had abandoned that Viking mentality quite long before, and they were fundamentally also different people from the continent. And so the Normans, the Hauteville, exploited also the peasant support, given the great opportunities that could arise from the collapse of Islamic Sicily. And as always, people invest in the country that is winning. And as such, Pisa became further wealthy, right? It was very important to control the Sicilian coasts, the straits. That was, the Kingdom of Sicily, as you know, would emerge as basically the single most, first of all, politically compact in all feudal Europe practically, and also with this dramatic location in the center of the Mediterranean. And so the main choke points from which most important trade would pass from east to west were to be seized by, again, a power that didn't have a navy on its own and therefore needed the one of these maritime republics. The same profiting mentality was reflected by the Byzantine relation with the Saracens. The first were essentially wiped out in a maritime sense. There was still some piracy that could never be eliminated until Victorian times by naval technology in general, from a political and strategic point of view. But the peasants would settle in various also North African markets that would reach as far as also in the south, where slaves, ivory, gold came from. So there is a very long-ranging activity. These merchants, by the way, traveled all the time around. They were actually literate people. They searched for manuscripts. So that's what the same pre-humanistic temper is really being perceived. All the translations from Greek, from Arab, right, at this point were literally sought by Europeans that already knew how to translate them, and that knew specifically what they were to search for. Much of what is said now at the revival, that was technology, science coming back, not really. It was the same Western Europeans that went to search for those things because they had already a practical knowledge and capacity, and they wanted just to refine that with a theoretical frame. And it was not like this dramatic civilizations of the East came and magically the world was expanded. This was actually a consequence of already an incredible boom that is, again, not witnessed in any other moment in history. Like, you cannot even compare it to the Industrial Revolution, because there was a technological background that favored it to with an effort that is not comparable to medieval times. And the rate growth in terms of economical potential of these countries was so big that in history, I don't know any other people, any other culture fundamentally that rose to those standards so quickly and so fast. Right? You can argue it in other civilizational sense. But especially from an economical point of view, and maybe exactly because the system was fragmented, you may not see that thing in a unitary way. But that is still the sap of what we call as properly as Western, narrowly meant, was being formed at the time, and this is dramatically overlooked. In the process, naturally, Pisa was also expanding as a city. In loco, the inhabitants of the countryside that flow to the city, where there is work, a lot of work, for building the ships and producing trade goods and so on, come to live outside of the older city gates, form these suburbs, and as always, there is the need to protect this, because they are the labor force. If there is an enemy raid or something, you need to protect these people. So these populations had expanded already as a settlement in Pisa beyond the Auser, the Cerchio. On the left Arno, there was also on the left of the Arno, there is the suburb of so-called Kinsica, which brought with a new enclosure of the walls between the 11th and the 12th century already, to the connection with the ancient city. And in this urban environment, the commune, as we know it, more openly was established. At the beginning, as we've seen, was formed mostly by a mix of noblemen from the countryside. They were more of a military, feudal character. Then there were eternal aristocrats, mostly invested in trade, merchant ship owners. But these were basically the same people, right? And it's this very variegated group that forms the consortium, right? Of this big clientels. The milites were just the apex in terms of individual power and force, for which, given their census, they had to provide with a military service on a war horse back, and so on. And they would literally control the city and the countryside from the top of the trade. But there were lots of other people who were under them: judges, notaries, merchants, etc., that served also as soldiers and also as workers and so on. And this great expansion naturally brings to a unity of political intents, because they have basically all the same interests. And naturally there are brutal fights within the same city walls, with episodes like the bishop of the city bringing like a catapult in a private citizen garden to bombard the tower of a rival faction, where this kind of niceties. And these were normal in many ways, great part also the military development. These are, as you know, the places where also the crossbow, most of actually European infantry development really is achieved in these centuries. In fact, really take place. And the broader point of the consortium, however, was to keep the city safe, and so this could happen only if it was very well armed, and also the sea free, right? So there was always a risk, as we were saying before. You could not eliminate that piracy or shipwreck or whatever, so war risk. But if the trade was more profitable, that was that risk was worth being run, and so the expeditions would be equipped, also militarily, in fact, to deter. And the consortium in Pisa is initially, like all these contracts and brotherhoods and guilds, etc., a private and temporary association, maybe created just for a single expedition, but it eventually widened to include all citizens. This is the particularity of the Pisa and also the broader maritime communal experience, right? That is an entire city revolving around most of this, in fact, maritime involvement and expedition participation. The consulate, as we've seen, develops from the aspiration of these mercantile and military aristocracy, whose interests are basically blended with those of the city. The growth of Pisan political, military, and economical power was mainly expressed with the acquisition of possessions and commercial rights towards the Levant during the period of the Crusades. Less than 2 months after the first one, for example, in 1099, a Pisan fleet of 120 ships arrived in the Holy Land to bring supplies to the Crusaders. You know that the Genoese had contributed to the storming of Jerusalem by essentially dismantling their own ships to build siege equipment, so much that the Saint Godfrey of Bouillon said this thing belongs to the Genoese on the entrance on Jerusalem's seat of power. And on the way, the Pisan Crusaders, accompanied by the Archbishop Dagobert, future Patriarch of Jerusalem, by the way, took the opportunity even to attack and plunder various islands of the Byzantine Empire, right? And a 17th century historian, essentially summing up the medieval chronicles in his history of the ancient city of Pisa, Giuseppe Setaioli, writes, quote, Patriarch, the Pisan Patriarch returned to his homeland at that time with the Pisan army stayed for 4 continuous years in those parts, wanting to return, in fact, to Pisa, remembering some injuries received from Calo Ianni, that is, Carlos Ioannis is the, is John Comnenus, Emperor of Constantinople, resolved, albeit, from long efforts weakened, wanted to go to the detriment of the said emperor and places, and reached up to Constantinople, that to the emperor, that frightened sent 6 ambassadors to ask for peace from the Pisans with some taxes as the said emperor would have paid, among which there were 50 heads of vestments for the Pisan church, for the cathedral, which there were some of them that stood upright for the quantity of gold. So the presence of Pisa and the other Italian republics was not limited to the support of the Crusaders, but was also aimed at establishing commercial colonies on their own in Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. Specifically, in the Pisan case, the concessions obtained made it possible to found colonies in Antioch, Acre, Jaffa, Tripolis in Syria, Tyre, Joppa, Laodicea, and Akkon. To these were added possessions in the same Jerusalem, Caesarea, and other colonies, and with a lesser degree of autonomy in Cairo, Alexandria, and the aforementioned Constantinople. In all these cities, the Pisans enjoyed great privileges and tax exemptions, but they also had the obligation to contribute to the defense in case of external attack, which was not a problem for them because they were to defend themselves from the same peoples that had granted them rights, that were always seeking for reoccupying those centers, in at least in the most strategically relevant ones. As for trade, they could have given them others that would be more accessible, so that they could storm when these communities became too encumbrant for them. And that was exactly the problem. Once when these powers were in trouble and the Italians would come, they would offer their naval support, but in exchange for these fortresses, that's again all they wanted. They were not interested in the interland, if it was especially threatened regularly by a major power. So you can understand, like Venice with Crete, or Saint Pisans, the Genoese with Corsica or Sardinia. Those were other things, but so, because they were desperate, right? So they would keep these castles, but they other fortresses, but that were very often fortified quarters altogether, very compact and difficult properly to storm. And they would remain eventually when the storm was over with this presence there, and they couldn't dislodge them because, again, they lacked especially naval power. That is the one that they had actually required the service of in exchange of these positions. So again, how could they storm these strongholds without a fleet on their own, as the latter could in fact always resupply the besieged? And this caused, as you know, we've seen it very often in the Byzantine history videos, pretty serious problems. At some point, there was also the massacre of the Latins, but at the end of the day, the empire was forced to take these Italians back, and to sell their soul in the process. Later on, also the entire Palaiologan reconquest was carried out to subcontracting of of the Aegean to the Genoese, and beyond, right? So the Pisans were at this point, especially their heyday was the 12th century, the 13th century. They were pretty aggressive as well, right? Normally we mentioned just the Venetians and the Genoese also because they were the ones that had eventually the most, say, the longest, more powerful history. But and they also, with the end actually of competition from cities like Pisa. But in these times, the competition was still open, let's say, and there was very much at stake, as you understand. In the 12th century, the Pisan presence in the Byzantine Empire and in Constantinople in particular increased dramatically. With a diploma in 1111, a district was made available to the Pisans in Constantinople, in the eastern part of the city, specifically with a church dedicated to Saint Peter, who was known as Saint Peter of the Pisans. And there were perhaps 1,000 Pisans living there. During the 12th century, relations with the empire also generally improved, to the point that Pisa, even for a few decades, obtained the position of preferred nation, traditionally assigned to Venice, that was quarreling, as you know, with Constantinople, so there were this kind of backs and forth. Venice had been by far the most aggressive and intrusive in Byzantine affairs, and was the one that could make more leverage, so at the time they were expelled because it had become intolerable, but again, they came back ever stronger until they basically stormed Constantinople in 1204 with the French. Even Ragusa/Dubrovnik in 1169 and Zara in 1188, out of the hostility to the Venetians, concluded trade treaties with Pisa, which thus had also very important interests in Dalmatia, in the Adriatic. Consider, as we'll see better now, that the Pisans were mostly involved with Sicily, and the Venetians were regularly enemies with anyone who would threaten the passage of the Otranto Strait, so from Apulia to Epirus. And thus, anyone who was supporting, conversely, the Siculo-Normans was also a rival in a way, and especially if these were the Pisans who were also in Constantinople, where the Venetians had most of their investments at some point, or at least the most politically relevant ones to play that game. However, as we will see, there wouldn't be much of an escalation between the Venetians and the Pisans. There were clashes, but they were minor. Just Pisa was much more focused in the Western Mediterranean, unavoidably, as also later Genoa would be. Yet it's worth noticing, as we were saying before, that the Eastern Mediterranean routes were the most important. So everybody was more or less seeking, again, to maintain their presence there. In fact, even when the Genoese were ousted by Venice and Aragon from most of the Levantine traffics, still there were Genoese colonies there, also in the Black Sea, and also the Pisans, as we were saying before, they had that. Also because at that point, specifically, Pisa was following the trail of Genoa, so very often, even when a power was knocked out, what this really meant is that their commercial capacity was integrated into one of the winner, so that it would be overall strong. I mean, you have lost, but rather than bailing out completely, we'll just invest in the one who defeated you, because at least you're stronger together, and that's literally what happened, at least in that context. As we were saying before, the Pisans appear already in the 11th century in the cities of southern Italy and Sicily, out of the aversion to the Saracens and for broader commercial reasons, they helped the Norman enterprise. However, they do not really favor the unification of the south, because they feared that the Normans could use the local cities to create a formidable naval power there as well. So, as often these powers, flourished in the enemy instability and ambiguity. They wanted to be, and they were, the tip of the balance in most of these international situations. The Pisans, in this case, tied up relations with the southern Italian cities that had remained historically free, more autonomous. For example, with Amalfi, they make an agreement in 1111 and also in 1126. Amalfi will resist for a long time against the Normans because it had an extraordinary position. There's just a huge mountain behind it on the sea. So logistically, for an army, it's terrifying, right? To try to storm it in a way or another. But it's always possible because wherever men go, you can go at some level. So on the long run, they were choked just by the Norman presence. Roger of Sicily finally subjugates it. And at this point, what do the peasants do from the sea? They do not hesitate actually to plunder and prostrate the same Amalfi. Just 9 years later, the last agreement in 1135 and eventually in 1137, because they didn't want the Oathfield to maintain a control of that, and so they destroyed. So that's how ruthlessly practical and and successful really these powers really were. Understanding politics in a crystalline way and basically not giving a damn about any kind of human mercy. And after the war against the same Siculo-Normans in 1134 and 1137, in fact, this is contextual to, in fact, the broader clash against the Siculo-Normans, in which also the Pope and the Emperor were involved. Of course, the peasants would have not engaged alone against the entire Kingdom of Sicily. They preferred, in fact, peaceful penetration and obtained by the Siculo-Normans, especially in Naples, a condition of privilege. Relations with the Arabs of Spain are poor, like they existed. Later on, the Genoese, for example, will keep trading with the Nasrids because they wanted to cripple the Aragonese by some degree. The peasants are more active in the Balearics after they had become again an independent Islamic state. Here too, the Genoese repeat the monopolizing attempt of the islands without being able to prevent the peasants from appearing on equal terms with them on the markets of Christian Spain. So there is already a first unavoidable attrition with Genoa that highlights that this is not just a minor power, but it can compete with the same Tuscan city for the control of the Western Mediterranean. From the mid-12th century, Pisa, through acquisitions of the local church, also had a terrestrial expansion in the Tuscan hinterland, in particular in the Era Valley, in the lower Arno Valley, and also in the south in the direction of Piombino. These will be normally the areas that the Pisan comitatus will maintain historically, because the Era Valley was contended to Lucca, and the lower Arno meant like a wide, fertile valley that was, also the objective of other Tuscan continental powers such as Florence, and in the next video will be how much that will escalate. And in the south, because there was really not much of another coastal power in Tuscany except Pisa. Factually, both Florence and Siena were trying to have their opening to the sea, but they were not sea powers, and so they had the problem that we previously described, so that they couldn't counter an already established maritime republic like Pisa, which instead did exactly this. Basically, they monopolized almost entirely the control of the Tuscan coast, and thus used the possessions they had on the sea to also make leverage on Tuscan internal policy, which the other communes didn't like at all, and that's why there was also generalized hatred against Pisa from all the other Tuscan cities, because it was really pursuing a different type of politics and strategy. Generally speaking, it was also siding with the emperor, as we will see better now, at the expense very often of the freedom of the rest of Tuscany, because if you had a Ghibelline power there, right, the Guelph one and the communes that hope to be more autonomous from imperial power would naturally suffer very much of that. Pisa could be fairly sure about her autonomy, exactly because she was needed powerful also by the emperors, right, that needed her fleets and the incomes and so on, and so they would, as we've seen just also in Tuscany, favor that what was the main center, at least it had been, right. There were other ones that were rising fast also in the continent as well, and that they would keep doing this, entering in contrast with the same Pisa later on. The main problem with Lucca, for example, it was just in the north, and so it was just trying, as we were saying before, to control a bit the Arno Valley for herself on the sea, was the castle of Montignoso, and also the control of the Francigena road, that is to say, the pilgrim route that from Canterbury led to Rome. Is one of the single most important pilgrimage axes, and thus also trade one in continental Europe. So especially the rivalry with Lucca could not be extinguished quickly, because again they were pretty close, a few tenths of kilometers, and they contended power on the same north, south, east, west routes, and especially in a moment in which the traffics on them were intensifying. But Pisa was the stronger power, by the way. Also, Lucca was not really it was not a maritime power, by the way, which also was pretty relevant for the aforementioned reasons. On the sea, Pisa essentially had curbed, together with Genoa, the Saracen threat in the Western Mediterranean, and projected towards the Levantine markets, where the city was mostly involved in fact in establishing new ports and securing diplomatic and trade relations with the local powers, right? And all this was done naturally in antagony with rival cities for the monopoly over such concessions. And so naval warfare, as you understand, was also intensifying the process. And Genoa was really the greater problem, because Genoa and Pisa are also fairly close after all. They face the same sea, the same Corsica, for example. And after the Balearic expedition, which was followed, as we've seen, by the Pisan, the granting of the Pisan primacy over Sardinia, the hostility between Pisa and Genoa turned into open war, because the Genoese had understood that the Pisan expansion was just the main threat to their also to their existence, because on the longer run they would have ended up also in the same Pisan sphere of influence if they had not fought back. So the Tyrrhenian became the battleground, or the battle water, let's say, between Pisa and Genoa. And it extended operationally also westwards, even reaching Languedoc and Provence. The Tuscan city had in fact intertwined profitable commercial relations with Ligurian cities like Noli and Savona already, also Montpellier in southern France. Genoa instead relied on the support of Jerez, Fos, Antibes, and Marseille. So there were, between southern France and northeastern Spain, different communities that sided from one or another. And obviously there was no main maritime power there that was really preventing the rise of the two cities, except for Barcelona, that would be also probably the center of a broader power, not just the county, but at the end of the day, the beating heart of the kingdom, the crown of Aragon, let's say. But the Italian power at this point was prevalent by far. It would fundamentally remain in a broader sense, because also later on with the Spanish expansion, still it was the Venetian and the Genoese naval power that made the thing at the end of the day. The hostilities began with the Genoese attack on some galleys heading for Pisa, and this war lasted until 1133. It was fought by sea and by land, but did not see any crucial battle, and it was essentially just a succession of coastal raids on Sardinia, Corsica, and other Tyrrhenian regions. There was finally an agreement, favored also by the intercession of Pope Innocent II. The papacy was trying to put an end to Christian bloodshed, providing for the division of the bishoprics of Corsica. This reflected how far the Genoese had gone already. Genoa would take Mariana, Nebbio, and Acca, while Pisa maintained the episcopal legacy of Sardinia entirely, and in Corsica of Aleria, Ajaccio, and Sagona. At the same time, there was, however, a war going on between the legitimate pope and the anti-pope Anacletus, supported by the king Roger II of Sicily. Pisa at this point participated in the related military expedition in favor of the legitimate pope, and on August the 6th, 1135, attacked Amalfi in the aforementioned clash. A convention signed in 1126 had been, as we've seen, in force with a Campanian city, and the way the peasants kind of changed their posture was considering invalid the same agreement due to the subjection to the Siculo-Normans, and it wasn't even like a wrong concept. The raiding on Amalfi on that occasion was terrifying. During the attack, ships in the port were looted, by the way, quite interesting. The peasants entered the nearby Ravello on the Amalfi coast as friends initially, but they betrayed the city and sacked it. But in the same way, in an attempt to return north through the aforementioned mountains, they were actually ambushed and slaughtered by the rebellions, crashed against the great fortification of the Scalandrone stream from the inside of the same walls. And 2 years later, as we were remembering, in 1137, there was yet another expedition of the Pope and Emperor Lothar II, in which Pisa struck Amalfi again. A phase of relative tranquility followed, however, during which in 1155 the expansion of the city walls continued, replacing the early medieval ones that were now obsolete for the demographic and economic needs of the city. At this point, Pisa also becomes more tied to the Germanic emperors, obtaining important concessions in the two diplomas of 1162 and 1165 by Frederick Barbarossa. With them, the emperor recognized Pisa, in addition to the jurisdiction over her countryside, properly as a commune, because that was previously the bishop's prerogative, also the freedom of trade in the territories of the Holy Roman Empire, the coast line from Civitavecchia to Porto Venere. That is an immense strip, because basically it's from basically the regional Rome up to Liguria, and also the possessions that the emperor wanted to secure in southern Italy. That is to say, half of Palermo, Messina, Salerno, Naples, all of Gaeta, Mazara, and Trapani, and a street with houses for merchants in every city of the Kingdom of Sicily. But these awards were actually reconfirmed later on by Henry VI, Otto IV, and Frederick II, when, as you know, the Hohenstaufen had managed to secure the succession to the Hauteville dynasty, and this had been in fact a major game changer, because basically the Holy Roman Emperor at that point that needed again from the north that safe haven, literally, to in fact carry out a Mediterranean policy, and especially in the Mediterranean, connecting the Italic kingdom more readily with the Sicilian possessions, needed unavoidably to secure the link that Pisa provided through her fleet. And as you see, this is what I always say when talking about the Germanic imperial policy in the Mediterranean, when also Otto of Brunswick, contending power actually from the young Frederick II, the Hohenstaufen dynasty, really behaved identically to the Hohenstaufen, both in Germany and in Italy, of course, because that was the most sound political, strategical thing to do. And Pisa remained the center of this universal project. The imperial edict and their subsequent confirmation had double consequences. First of all, the Pisans got this enormous power again in Sicily, that were, not literally everything had been given to them, but still, the privileges were secured by a certain extent, and the Tuscan city was very happy with that. But at the same time, the other Tuscan communes were quite triggered by this, and especially by the fact that basically the entire Tuscan coastline was recognized by the emperor to the Pisans, which means that cities like Massa, Volterra, Lucca, and Florence, who aspired to an autonomous outlet to the sea, wouldn't get any of that, and they feared actually to be choked in the process by the rise of what seemed to be at that point of a Germanic empire capable of reuniting West and East, and fundamentally carrying out a centralizing policy in the same kingdom of Italy. As you know, things went differently because the Lombard League defeated Frederick Barbarossa in 1176, And so basically the possibility of having a strong grip on the Italic kingdom to centralize, etc., was evaporated. But at the same time, the risk was still present, especially after Henry, Frederick's son, who had been associated to the throne, by the way, had married Constance of Hauteville, and so in one shot, the Hohenstaufen had gotten the entire kingdom of Sicily, and still in the process, Pisa had greatly capitalized, and the ambitious Tuscan communes didn't accept this, and so there was some broader polarization also of the struggle against the emperor, or at least the imperial party, generally speaking, that would have eventually developed into the Guelphs and the Ghibellines that I made a video on, and that has become algorithmic because unitly people are interested in these clashes that were literally to shift the balance of the entire universal power at that point. So also consider great commercial expansion from all sides, right? In spite of the rivalries, etc., the European civilization was overall more powerful, intertwined, and so also the Tuscan hinterland cities were growing in power, and for not talking about the fact that Genoa was quite upset of the sudden Pisan comeback with imperial support, and a new war broke out between the two maritime city-states. And the casus belli, let's say, had been the strengthening of the Pisan presence in Sardinia. That was a bit like the El Dorado of the situation. In fact, the Pisans had begun to colonize it, practically. Sardinia was ruled formally still by the so-called judicates that were essentially a remnant of the late antique political institutions, right, of the Roman Empire, and that, however, had been framed and would be framed, as we will see better, properly within the Holy Roman Empire again. But the Sardinian hinterland was rather wild, right? And poor, right? There were mines, but the locals were not so developed to fully capitalize on it. Again, the maritime republics were more aggressive and enterprising and powerful. They could control the coastal lines, and they would even keep expanding on in the hinterland, so that there was a saying in Pisa that sounded something like, citizen in Pisa and king in Sardinia, because the republic still stressed that kind of idea of egalitarianism, a bit of a kind of a Roman, at least senatorial way, given that they were all aristocrats in one way or another. In Sardinia, these people, like, it was just the Wild West. They could do whatever the hell they wanted. They enslaved the Sardinians. They coerced them into working in their fields and the mines. They got back with lots of gold, and so the recent increase in Tyrrhenian power by Pisa, given the benefits received in Sicily, had contributed to increase the grip on the island, and the Genoese felt cut out from this. Naturally, the object of the dispute with the Ligurian city was also a broader one, because there was at stake also the reciprocal positions in Sardinia and Corsica, as well as the grabbing of the markets of South France, where Genoa had assumed a currently predominant position in the meanwhile, also in Spain. The hostilities thus began in August 1165 on the Rhone, where peasant settlements were located, with a failed attack by the Genoese, allied with the same Count of Toulouse, towards a peasant convoy supported by the Provençals instead. So there you see that there is also an internal feud between Occitanians, for which the County of Toulouse, that I made a video on, it was kind of the largest power in southern France, wanted to extend its control further in Provence, not quite successfully, because it was not really much of a territorial power as we intended, but were supported by also by the Catalans. There was a very deep game going on, and all this in a time of broader criticism against the same papal institutions, because of the spread of the Catharism in the south of France, and also this was all deeply intertwined. And on September the 13th, 1165, on the banks of the Rhone, near Saint-Gilles, a battle took place between the peasants and the Genoese. And at first the Genoese had been preventing for many days from being able to return to Pisa on their galleys, until the peasants decided to attack the Genoese entrenched camp, defeating the enemy army and causing them huge losses and material damage. So that after that victory, the peasants were able to return to Pisa with reinforced commercial relations in Provence. And in the process, the cities of Narbonne, Montpellier, Saint-Gilles, Marseille, Grasse, Nice huddled together in Pisa until the two rivals preferred to cease the hostilities on this theater, at least, and carry out their energies in a more peaceful contest, let's say, because these operations really costed a lot anyway, right? And the galleys, yes, were again the prerogative of these powers, but exactly for the fact that they were symmetric in that a naval defeat, or also an amphibious one, depending here the forces involved, could be significant in shifting the balance in favor of one of the two, right? Later on, I don't spoil anything, because this was what any person that knows what medieval history is. Genoa would crush the peasants in the late 13th century at the Meloria, right? And so there are, at that point, the peasant naval power is knocked out, and it's always a matter of also how much you can concentrate in a short time. And at that point, the Genoese had the upper hand, right? Pisa did not decline immediately, but that blow was, in a sense, the beginning of a broader decline. It could be reversed in some ways. So many different things really happened, but there was also an important strengthening of the Ligurian city in the process. There were, in fact, other clashes without any sensational episode, let's say, until 1175. But there was also the problem of Sicily to settle, right? And here, due to the aforementioned privileges granted by Henry VI to actually both cities, not just to the peasants, there were various clashes that began with the peasant conquest of the entire city of Messina in 1192. And this brought to further bloodshed throughout all Sicily until the Genoese conquered Syracuse in 1204. These are really important cities, right? And located quite strategically. And imagine this again in a context which that was pretty messed up, because these are the years of the minority of Frederick II after Henry VI's premature death and so on. So, of course, these two republics profit with the fact of the broader, actually European engulfment that caused until the Battle of Bouvines, right? And so they began to clash over the quite perturbed kingdom of Sicily. And the commercial positions in the island were in fact lost by the Pisans with the agreement between the Tuscan Guelph League, at that point led by Florence, and Pope Innocent III, who, despite having revoked the excommunication launched to the peasants a short time before Celestine III, soon after also agreed with Genoa, weakening further the peasant positions in southern Italy. And the reason being that the imperial power had become too cumbersome for the papacy in that context, so that, generally speaking, the more Pisa had invested in the Hohenstaufen and the least sympathetic it had been to the papacy, of course. The Genoese seize immediately the opportunity, also because Innocent III embodies the acme of Roman Catholic power in the history of mankind. Basically, everyone at this point in Western Christendom is a papal fief of some sort. And it's, in this kind of late Swabian age that that eventually depolarization between the various Guelph and Ghibelline wars of leagues, let's say, will start to take much, in fact, larger, in fact, regional scale significance also for the theater of operation. So this Pisan defeat in the Kingdom of Sicily is really a major turning point. It's worth stressing how Roman and imperial the Pisans really felt historically in their role. Genoa had another history. Genoa had less of a urban and more of a kind of a private nature. And paradoxically, it succeeded, right, against Pisa in this context, albeit it wouldn't against Venice, that instead had the best actual statal system of all the maritime republics. And in the following years, there were, however, the foundations laid for further subsequent clashes with the intensification of peasant commercial penetration in southern France. That was seen now as an important area where the Tuscan commune could not afford to let the Genoese simply taking over. From 1208, Pisa, for example, stipulates commercial agreements with the villages of Fos and Jerez that, as we've seen, had mostly been under the Genoese orbit. There are also agreements with the Count of Barcelona to renew the privileges in Arles and Saint Egidius, and there is also a 30-year peace treaty with the commune of Marseille, and a 50 years one with that of Narbonne. These are the most important centers of southern France, and also Barcelona in Spain. So, coastally speaking, this is, a significant, entrance of Pisa in some markets that had been deeply connected with Genoa. There are some agreements also with Grasse, also with Aachen in the east. Around the same time, Pisa attempts a policy of penetration in the Adriatic to challenge the Venetian supremacy in that sector. We've seen it before. There is, in 1180, a non-aggression pact stipulated between Pisa and Venice. But in the same year, Manuel I Comnenus dies, and this changes a lot in the internal balance in Constantinople, because, as you know, power was seized by a xenophobic faction. And Pisa seizes this opportunity to attack the Venetian convoys in the process. At the same time, the desire to counter the Venetians in the Adriatic was mostly commercial and diplomatic. remember before the agreements with Zara, with Split, but also with other Italian cities in the Adriatic. There were fundamentally also maritime republics, especially Ancona, but also Brindisi in the south. And you understand that these were traditionally Venetian adversaries. So this does reflect some, of course, the opportunities the Pisans were exploiting because of a temporary weakening of Venice that, however, was resuming energically also her policy. In 1188, there was a peace treaty with Zara, which made the city independent from Venice for just a few years. However, in 1195, a Pisan expedition ventured up to Pola in an attempt to induce the city to rebel against Venice. And this does occur, but also Venice regains the city immediately. So there is a 10 years peace signed in 1196 on favorable terms for the Pisans, which was short-lived enough as 3 years later the Tuscan Republic returned to the attack with a naval blockade near Brindisi, which ended, however, in a disastrous defeat at the hands of the Venetians. There was no full-scale war, though. As we were saying before, operationally speaking, Pisa was just not capable to sustain a war against Venice from the other side of Italy. It was too expensive. So in 1206, the two cities signed a treaty which Pisa fundamentally renounced to her expansionistic aims in the Adriatic, while maintaining control of the outlets already acquired. Like, this was not really a problem for the Venetians as long as there was no interference. Actually, could even favor, in part, the broader trade activity. But the real meaning of the treaty is actually anti-Genoese, because Pisa and Venice generally understood that the Genoese expansionism was potentially threatening for everyone involved. In fact, Genoa was rising quite quickly, and Pisa felt threatened now by her, as well as, Venice understood that if Pisa had been knocked out, the Genoese would have had an enormous, basically uncontested control of the Western Mediterranean, and the resources could have been enormous to counter, and really putting in difficulty the same Serenissima. Also, Venice and Pisa began to cooperate to conquer the Constantinopolitan market for good. The Byzantine Empire was weakening, and especially at this point had grown dependent on the Latin trade, so they could exploit the thing in spite of the subtle competition that kept going on. In any case, Pisa at this point was really a florid international market, right? And it was known all over Europe. Like, Pisan merchants were present in Strasbourg, Nuremberg, Brugge, and they, the city itself was essentially feeling enormously over itself, right? This greatness was celebrated at the feast of Saint Mary in August, and at the time the Pisans, from the sources, looked upon everybody else with contempt, basically. There is a passage from Donizo which sees with disgust the pagans and the Turks and the Libyans and the Parthians and the Chaldeans and similar monsters of the sea that the Pisans were able to tame, right, by colonizing their coasts and essentially also engaging in this enormous volume of slave trade that made the city so powerful and prestigious, right? They were really dominating the seas in their own kind, and there was, aside from these other Italian maritime republics, no other that could contest that way of life, that mindset, right? That kind of properly humanistic ideal that was reinvigorating still at the acme of the traditional universal revival, as it seemed, especially from a Roman and imperial background in Pisa, the most fulgent result and accomplishment of such a city. So it's as I was saying at the beginning of the video, almost impossible to resume briefly all the enormous cultural, civil, and civilizational accomplishments of Pisa at this point. Just we remember the foundation of the famous Pisan School of Legal Studies, which also Florence tried to emulate. The accounting practices, the mathematical studies, the naval engineering. There is an immense contribution that Pisa makes to Western and world civilization. Now, speaking from an institutional point of view, which is also crucial because the city was expanding, this cultural base is also, transforming its political and social, essence. In the first decades of the 12th century, the figure of the Viscount, so this relic essentially of feudal administration in the form of, in fact, there would have been a count of Carolingian, if not in the ducal binomium, also Longbard one, and that was being considered now even as a substitute, right, as Viscount, not even properly the county of it. Somebody was appointed temporarily by the emperor, was finally removed from the office of judge, right? In other words, they said, okay, we are fully in control of our internal justice. In 1153, after a fierce battle with the consuls, the Viscount lost the Gastaldate as well. It was also another office of specifically Lombard origin that had to do properly with a sort of royal appointment and some, in fact, prerogatives connected with that back in the history of the Italic kingdom. The bishop still represented the commune in public acts, right? This is what the communes really did. The Italian communes, they overthrew the bishop, but still, not in the sense, of course, that there was no bishop again. That was still the main spiritual figure. It had a comital power, especially confirmed institutionally since Ottonian times, and that now the communes were essentially handling on their own, but in a paternalistic way. Yes, this is the bishop doing it, but practically that comital power is exercised by the commune, a sort of subcontract, right? And so they were also pretty subtle from a legal point of view, because this was a completely innovative thing in feudal law. Naturally, the bishop had a great power. It provided the city with great moral strength, and the diocese had maintained its rights over the district, also on the islands, as we've seen. So this had been the gateway to Pisan conquests in many ways. However, as we were saying, effective power gradually passed to the consuls. Soon the episcopal jurisdiction will be no more than kind of a abstract concept, while the consular brief, which is a document which the first form is from the beginning of the 12th century, and the oldest drafting, which has come down to us, dates back to 1162, gives unity and continuity to the communal government, and in fact the so-called breve populi, so the brief of the people, which is also distinct from, say, since 1171. It represents fundamentally the obligations of the citizens towards the commune. And you understand here there is a work towards a more subtle direction. And from this moment on, the rich statutory legislation of Pisa takes place, at least the documentable one, the one from which we really start understanding the internal mechanism. In 1160, there is also the so-called Constitution of Use, together perhaps at the same time with that of the law being published. And there is a deep Romanity, as we were saying before, in Pisan identity and memory. And as we were also recalling, Pisa is on the fore, really, for juridical studies, and especially the reconstruction of the same Roman law. The Pisan merchants are the ones that have the best access to the Eastern libraries. And they are, as part of the Italic kingdom, for example, differently from Venice, much more involved in the imperial matter, the idea of necessitating that reconstruction of the older codex, and thus there is also a spread of the same Roman law in practice, because given these were some of the most thriving centers full of transactions, negotiations, the Roman law disciplined these things in a more complete way, for which we know that Roman law is declared in Pisa since 1141, retentis quibusdam de lege Longobarda. That is to say, basically, the Longobard law that had been historically, ethnically, the base of the Italic kingdom's law, with the Edictum Rotary, etc., is dispensed of. Like, basically, Pisa uses Roman law, and nobody's owed to respect the Longobards one. And this ideology also revolves around the veneration of the famous codex and the Pandettes, right? Which perhaps the same Burgundio of Pisa, died in 1194, brought from Constantinople. And in fact, Pisans are Bulgarus, Uguccio, Bandinus, all masters in the juridical studium of Bologna, the first European university, structured substantially around the reconstruction of Roman law. But this makes you understand, as we were saying before, how deeply interconnected the Italian communes really were, and how the Pisans were also representing some of the finest of the intelligentsia, properly, this kind of deep, cultural legacy and everything, or juridical to a scientific point of view. In 1193, there is also news of, fact, juridical teaching at the University of Pisa. During the 12th century, also the communal system has become more complex, right? The city has expanded dramatically from a demographic point of view, from a also from an economical point of view. So the government needed more control, more regulations. Most of this revolved around, naturally, the military service and expenses. The Senate, or Council of Belief, as it was called, initially emanating from the consulate, was organized now as an autonomous judiciary that tended to become the depository of actual sovereignty in the city. The administration of justice previously entrusted, at least in the directive function and in the ratification to the councils of the commune, found its own magistrate in the Council of Justice. Along the political institute of the commune, also other cooperative institutes developed, in fact, and this was normal because you had, for example, the order of merchants, then the art of wool, then other arts, middle and minor, with their own, with their own groups represented, and their own patrimony and captains and consuls, right? So this was hardly, again, a unitary state. These, however, were these institutions represented an ever more, let's say, structured system with properly some in fact, universities that were ruled by some oligarchs that needed to be represented in the government and expressed the, of course, the complexity of the commune. These organisms have fundamentally economic functions, right? They mostly, as always, when a state is forming, you need money. You need money for war, for everything, so they mostly regulate that aspect, given that they are the same people that eventually make money as a state, right? So what really happens at this point is to create kind of a more centralized system in which you can more or less agree how much money must be paid for the various policies, and you need a debate about that, a dialogue between those that have eventually to act unitarily, because they need that. And Pisa historically has an interesting history of unity that is reflected also by her military effectiveness at some point, and that is always, as you know, the key for military success. And so all these various assemblies will take on the character of political institutions and remain in broader government of the city. The noble families organized themselves in domus, so literally households, with their own armies and councils and captains, and the inhabitants of the quarters and parishes gathered in companies of citizens that altogether participated to the broader expeditions that came, in fact, to be ever more costly, and so the magnates also need to organize them ever more. And naturally, these people, as we were saying before, had possessions overseas, and they needed to control them, to pay for the garrisons, for building the castles, and so on. So it was a very complex system. There is also, at the end of the 12th century, like in the other Italian communes, the appearance of the podestà, that is this essentially military commander that was formally called to essentially have the local statutes respected, but that factually would become the commander of the military, at least the de facto commander of the military operations, due to properly a military background. And this is kind of a protocondottiere career that is also, in fact, monopolized by single families, and that are exchanged among the various Italian communes, so that they tended to say know better the policy and the laws of that city, so it could be passed from father to son as knowledge and practice and connections, right? And the idea is that they had to be super partes, so that they wouldn't favor one faction or the other, which naturally shows how also deeply factionalized the system had become, right? Some cities were properly torn apart by the clashes, and Pisa surely had a lot of violence flaring, but it was, after all, one of the most functional communes at the same time. The first podestà we know is a Gherardesca, as a very famous comital family, Tadicius of Castagneto in 1190. And this step naturally is also one towards the greater political compaction of the political direction. Say it's the idea of, again, having a single head, not just too many factions quarreling with each other, right? As long as the podestà would operate for the general, say, good of the city, right, the various factions would have had to adapt somewhat to the situation. Otherwise, they could have been expelled at risk to trigger internal violence, and that's exactly what the podestà there was to prevent. Some see it in a sense as the beginning of the end of the say the communes as a critical phase, but the most updated historiography has actually proved otherwise. It is to say, this is actually the most important step towards statalization, and actually a much more compact and functional government that in fact would reach its apex exactly with the popolo signory, was still with the important role of podestas, and that de facto became lords in that function, but at the end of the 13th century and beyond. So we'll see it next video. As we were saying before, Pisa has also an interland interest. It, as any other commune, would fundamentally expand its control on the surrounding territory, subduing the residues of feudal dominions and extending through the bishop formally her dominion over the castles that are ancient or new possession of the diocese, from a legal point of view, but also on over nascent rural communities as they were emerging from these rich, fertile countrysides. For example, in the case of Pisa, Cascina, Bientina, Vico, Leghorn, Vada, Piombino, and so on. There's also Pisan control of the Elba island, that since antiquity was rich in mineral resources, and the immigration of metal and stone workers there had long since, in fact, laid the foundations for the communal dominion on the island. Elba is just very close to Pisa, and kind of more difficultly controllable by any other power. Pisa had already in the 12th century one of her captains in Capo Liberi, from whom the whole island depended. In the large Tyrrhenian islands, we cannot speak exactly of a direct Pisan political dominion, right? This is not really sanctioned. As we've seen, there is an archiepiscopal authority on the local churches, but the commune does not literally own land from a formal point of view. It's the Pisan aristocrats that really own land and castles on private account, right? In Sardinia, especially, the Pisan merchants have already affirmed themselves by means of trade, but also military occupation, the purchase of lands. Most of this has been negotiated with the islands' judicates that are also competing with one another, and also Genoa is involved, etc. So, as we were saying before, the Italian republics are bringing properly communal civilization. They're more advanced. They, in a sense, the judicates cannot do really much. They are a more primitive culture in the interland, and they they don't have the capacity of dislodging such forces. The Archbishop of Pisa, as we've seen, had the title of legate since the time of Urban II, and later, 1133, the one of primate. In the first half of the 12th century, the judicates of Lugudoro, of Gallura, and of Cagliari were under Pisan hegemony. So Pisa controlled the fact that the majority of the island was just like mostly a peasant thing. So the Genoese intervention would be something external. But there were also other Italian noblemen who were involved, generally speaking, in this kind of colonization. And there is still today trace of the Pisan institution, culture, and art in Sardinia. There are places probably are known as Pisan something, Pisan Tower, Port, whatever. There is probably also a Tuscan of Sardinia that comes from the times of Pisan domination. Initially, even though the island would be seized by Genoa, the Pisan ties are even stronger with Corsica, right? That is even just closer. Corsica is even wilder than Sardinia, that after all does have some resources, especially in the south. But the broader link is, Tuscany, Elba, Corsica, right? And in the regions had intense relations since the Lombard age, where at some point we know that, in fact, some Lombard Tuscan bishops, for example, had possessions in Corsica and so on. Other noblemen were there. Also in the Carolingian times, we know that Corsica depended on the Italic kingdom and so on. The Pisans' penetration of the island was profound. Even before Gregory VII gave in 1077 the office of legate to the Bishop of Pisa Landulf, as we were saying before. And Urban II granted, in fact, in 1091, the island as an ecclesiastical fief to the Bishop Dagobert of Pisa, rising it a year later to the archiepiscopal dignity. Which means, of course, that all the Corsican bishops are suffragan of the Pisan ones. And finally, as we were seeing before, Innocent II had split in 1135 the island between Pisa and Genoa, right, dividing the rights of primacy between them as well in the process. The Pisans extracted from Corsica what still the Romans did at the time, like wood, honey, and wax. And frankly, there wasn't much else there. And then, Sardinia at least had grain in the south. But these were still useful goods that also could be exchanged. Local elites with the products of Italian industry at that point, of which Pisa was one of the greatest representatives, let's say, or those that also were brought overseas from the east, spices, etc. There were also some forms of communal order there, in the form of especially rules of the Pisan statutory law, right? Purely Tuscan customs and social and civil life, right? As we were saying before, also language. The splendor of an art that would repeat for a long time the motives of the most ancient Pisan art. In the Tuscan hinterland, as we were saying before, there was a competition with Lucca for the control over the Francigena road and the control of the Arno Valley. In fact, Lucca controlled both banks at a point, and this was a way for the city to divert part of the traffic that ran throughout all Tuscany just at the last in the last section, and depriving Pisa of part of that. And in fact, the Lucchese had established the port of Motrone. The first known clash between Pisa and Lucca for these matters is witnessed in 1030, right? So these are century-long neighboring conflicts, as you understand, that also explain to you how deeply the hatred, the competition really was between them, and you understand how much was at stake, in fact, in the process. And it's a conflict that could not really be solved, right? There were truces, but the two cities were so close, and they had so much they could easily interfere against one another through that there couldn't really be and various external influences, by the way, all over the period, that there was always some problem coming from that front. There was a long war fought from 1143 to 1155, in which the Pisans won and managed to secure control of the Era Valley, which was an important blow for Lucca, also ensuring the communication of Pisa with this wide hinterland. And the dispute with Lucca naturally is intertwined with the rivalry between Pisa and Genoa as well, right? Lucca is, basically in between the in fact, the district, the comitatus of Pisa and Genoa, that controls all of Liguria. So naturally, there are several obstacles in between. There are many houses locally that, for example, the Malaspina, etc., that got a bit of mostly feudal lineages, also quite militarily involved, that literally leave out of the, as mercenaries, out of these clashes, and all these intertwined with a broader international policy, especially the imperial one, and more. Genoa is established in the second half of the 12th century in Porto Venere, and thus is supportive of Lucca to maintain a broader control of the area and to kind of creep towards that direction in an anti-Pisan function, also as a naval base. And as we've seen, Genoa succeeds in overcoming the Pisans in Corsica. The Pisans maintain for a while, but also they have to give up, only the last stronghold in the south, that is the Boniface Castle, and Genoa even manages to overturn the political situation in Sardinia, right? Receiving an important support of the Judicates, except that of Gallurum in 1165. But Pisa has, from her side, the strength of the empire. We explained the reasons in the general continental sense, and especially after the Hohenstaufen control over Sicily. For this reason, also, Pisa is a gateway a bit for the same imperial penetration in the area, because it just takes to reach it. Also, across the peninsula, passing the Apennine to just embark from there. Genoa, Lucca, and Florence, that all come from a different background, but they are sensitive, of course, about this, because they don't want to be subjugated by an increased imperial control in the area. There are different things going on at different times. Also, Genoa will be used at some point by the emperors to embark themselves. But let's say there is a generalized hatred towards Ghibelline Pisa from these wealth powers that are instead rising, also in a broader kind of often central Italian, speaking especially the rest of Tuscany, and the fact it would be a papally supported side, especially in the 13th century, but everything was really complicated. Also, as a local point of view, it's a general trend. The Pisan imperial privileges had been affirmed, as we've seen, by Henry IV, Henry V. We don't know whether the ones of Lothar, Supplenburg, and Conrad III on communal autonomy were really a forgery or some sort of kind of more enforced negotiation, all point by Pisa at some point. In any case, there was a clear, support of the imperial cause by the peasants in general. In 1137, the Pisan commune was, for example, close to the empire in Lothar's expedition against the Siculo-Normans. And even though, of course, you have to imagine that not Pisa herself was seeking to be subjugated by anyone. She just knew how important her role was there, and eventually the emperors were to essentially privilege the city, just because very often it was one of the few ones that they could control in Italy. And in fact, when the Germanic power goes, say, with iron fist, like at the time of Barbarossa, the relations with Pisa are cold, at first at least, because the same peasants seem to fear the imperial restoration designs. They were quite, as you know, centralizing, pretty brutal, and really uncompromising. And that's why former, in fact, imperial allies turned eventually against the same Frederick. But from 1155, the Pisan establishment clung to the emperor, right? This after his failed his first expedition to Italy. It was also failure, by the way, and in a sense, because also they were protecting their interests in broader southern Italian areas, because a weak Germanic empire was a strong Byzantine one. So it's a very complicated game. We don't have time to look at the details because they really change sometimes year from year, right? So we will hopefully see it on another occasion. And there's also an internal divide, naturally, because, for example, the nobility supported Barbarossa in the siege of Milan, while at the same time the Archbishop, Villanus, the clergy, and the people of Pisa supported, in the schism of 1159, the parts of the Pope Alexander III. So you have there already the prefiguration of the Guelphs and the Ghibellines as it would have eventually kind of extremized later on. On April the 6th, 1162, Frederick had, as we've seen, given full recognition to the commune regarding the entire civil but also criminal jurisdiction, which was a great deal because it recognized the full power of the secular authority there. It granted the peasants all the territory, as we've seen, up to all the Tuscan coast fundamentally for them, and promised this key possessions in the Kingdom of Sicily. However, that expedition, because this was all done in function of the Germanic invasion of southern Italy, but that was not carried out. Also, the expedition against Rome in 1167 fails. So at that point, the fervor for the imperial cause failed, right? Imagine always, like today, everything that happens is measured on the political thermometer, and the governments adapt to the situation. And on that occasion, in fact, the Archbishop even returned to the city with an increased power. The feudal rights are impaired still by the tenacious policy of the commune against the episcopal jurisdiction, so there was no possibility of a reversal of that. But the city, for example, makes a so-called perpetual peace with the king of Sicily in 1169, and also with the Byzantines that were also enemies of Frederick, as we were saying, in 1171. There was a broader attempt to maintain any door open according to the advantage. The peasants managed at some point to defeat Lucca at Motrone, so destroying that important connection that the Lucchese could provide to Genoa by essentially making them access their own Arno branch, fundamentally. And as such, Pisa is decided to properly get rid of the problem entirely by allying herself, even with Florence, that had never been a friendly power, but by granting privileges to the Florentine industry along the Arno on July the 4th, 1171. So you understand that in this situation, relations with the emperor do seem to have deteriorated. The Pisan and Florentine consuls, for this reason, are put in chains in 1172 by the emperor that is carrying out this devastating struggle against the Lombard League and the other Italian communes. And in the peace imposed by Frederick in 1175 in Pavia, the capital of the kingdom, Sardinia, that as we've seen in 1165 was given an imperial fief to the peasants, was divided between them and the Genoese as that retaliation, and also the papacy had participated in this after all. But on the longer run, and we'll see it better in the second video, Pisa would come back fully Ghibelline. It's just like one of those powers that fundamentally remain always the same from that point of view, and the reason being that there are major interests that are simply played in the fact that they are a port, right? And so you cannot much change that situation, the preeminence of the city, the broader. Of course, this is connected also with the type of possessions that Pisa had, as we've seen, especially with Sicily. And that's why Henry VI, while preparing himself for the Sicilian expedition, because of course when he even married Constance, the Siculo-Norman barons rebelled, and so at that point the emperor needed naval support against the south. There was a further concession to Pisa, not just of all the southern possessions that were, granted to them as ports, etc., but also the entire Corsica in 1191, which is also a measure that goes against the previous. In fact, it's an important imperial measure that upsets a bit like the entire Guelph part in that situation. But it's also not really a desperate mean, but it's just a way of saying, look, that if you are with us, we will always reward you anyway. And it was just naturally a false premise, because not even Henry could not just properly giving them Corsica, which he did not control, especially without Pisa, but also he couldn't really give this city too much, because in the broader political balance, that was just an extreme that was just granted in a moment of let's say of emergency. However, there is another mechanism for which, first of all, there's the League of St. Genesius in 1197, which is essentially a Tuscan league that allied itself against imperial power. So it's a Guelph league, except at this point Guelph really stands for a pro-imperial, in fact, siding, because this is the phase in which Otto of Brunswick, emperor, that had sworn the papacy not to reunite Germany and Sicily and Italy. The first thing he does, as the Hohenstaufen had done before, against whom he had risen as power. I made a video about Philip of Swabia and the rise of Otto of Brunswick. Invades Italy. It's the first thing he does. And in southern Italy, it was Frederick II. And at that point, the peasants side with Otto, because it's the same story. He was asking for their help navally, and they were to give it to them, and they decided to bet against, in fact, the odds. And in fact, the League of St. Genesius is crippled because Pisa is lacking in this effort, because they thought they would join as Hohenstaufen allies. Instead, they didn't. They still were more interested in that function that Otto was asking to them. Naturally, as you know, Otto fails, and the peasants thus will remain gibbeling with Frederick II, even though the meaning had changed again. Despite also, of course, the Frederick II decentralizing policy, because in those times it was not like in Barbarossa's ones, in which it was technically possible to literally kind of race to the ground the Italian communes, doing something extremely violent and just using Iron Fist to centralize further, retaking Constantinople and having the kind of power that would have changed a lot of things. In Frederick's times, it was evident that the Italian communes altogether could not really be subdued, and that it was mostly a matter of cooptation of some sort. And so Pisa decided to play the imperial card as always, because Frederick II was the only one that could use Pisa in that guise as well, in the way it could do better. And in fact, Frederick II was very harsh against the Lombard communes. Instead, rewards Pisa, respecting her franchises and the freedom of trade. And in fact, in Corsica, the Pisan influence expands once again under Frederick II. That also has a broader interest in Sardinia, and it made of it a kingdom for his son Heinz. So there was a Pisan connection there as well. And so Pisan power seems to be resurgent once again. In fact, between the end of the 12th and beginning of the 13th century, the Pisans had managed to oust again a bit the Genoese. Cagliari had been conquered in 1187 by the judge Obertus of Massa, right? That was, in this sense, a Pisan representative. In fact, Cagliari was the most important city in Sardinia, in the south, and the only basically large fertile area that could provide the city with some minimal also maritime capacity. And it had been a maritime republic of some sort herself, so controlling that was a very important way of controlling most of, at least some of the most important part of the island. It was from the opposite side, also from Genoese intervention, closer to Sicily, to Africa. However, in 1215, Visconti occupied it, only temporarily. This brought to the construction of the so-called Castro Castle, which means the same thing, like castrum, over the city in 1216. Right, it's castrum is just like you have a fortification over the city, and so you can control it better to avoid this kind of coups that could occur if the city is exposed by the sea. And these are all naval operations that were taking place. In fact, the fortress will give to the peasants an edge, in fact, over the local judicate, and generally speaking, all over the island. In fact, the peasant control over Sardinia will factually end with the Aragonese conquest of Castro. the Battle of Cisterna in the 20s of the 14th century. So in the process, the peasants settled further on the coasts. They created small communities of merchants in the ports, the usual thing, right? And in the meanwhile, of course, obtaining from the judges of Sardinia the faculty of establishing consuls and podestas, so replicating basically as colonies the same Pisa in part, with in fact the judicates of the interland kind of accepting this as signing with the various factions that were playing the much bigger game than theirs, but in which also they could have a control in a way. So you understand it's a very complex story and somewhat also difficult to tell, but we will see this in some detail, perhaps also in other videos, and I'll make hopefully soon the second part of this video about, in fact, Pisan history from the 13th to the 15th century. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.